Hello, everyone. So this is going to be a basic tutorial on endurance looping with Nadu in cEDH, right? So to kind of give an overview of why we would engage with endurance loops in cEDH Nadu, it requires a bit of an understanding of how this deck wins ordinarily, right? So very typically, the way Nadu wants to win in cEDH is you want to get to a point where you can trigger Nadu's ability enough to conceivably put your entire deck in your hand, or at least all non-land cards in your deck into your hand, and all lands into play from your deck. After this happens, or in the process of this happening, you've likely produced a lot of Scute Swarm copies from Scute Swarm and insect tokens from either Springheart and Tuco or Scute Swarm before 6 lands are in play to put it online to then make copies instead of insect tokens, right? So a typical board state when Nadu is kind of at an end game, going to win the game scenario is something like a way to trigger Nadu for or put Nadu triggers on the stack, also known as Oracle draws on the stack. Oracle draw being referenced to Coiling Oracle, which is a Simic card that says when this creature enters the battlefield, will reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it in play. If it's an online, put it in your hand. That's sort of what Nadu's granted ability is templated from. So I'll use the term Oracle draw a lot to just kind of shortcut what Nadu's or explain what Nadu does. So once you have a lot of tokens in play, a lot of creatures in play, once you've used Shuko, your way to enable Oracle draws and put your entire deck in your hand or all your lands into play, you're then going to tap a card like Gaia's Cradle, which is right here, to float a lot of green mana. You're going to then dump all that green mana into Finale of Devastation, give your creatures haste, and turn your board sideways, and you'll kill all your opponents. Because again, there's probably thousands, plural, of Scute Swarm copy tokens and dozens of insect tokens. So this is how normally Nadu would prefer to win in cEDH. And that's unique. Not many decks win with combat. Kinnan uses Finale of Devastation, but Nadu represents another deck where utilizing this as a win con feels very streamlined, especially given how Nadu operates, right? And the concept of Oracle drawing your entire deck. So the question becomes, why would we use endurance loops? Why would we use endurance loops? Typically speaking, the reason we would use endurance loops is because for whatever reason, we no longer have access to Finale of Devastation. In theory, endurance loops also are useful when we no longer have access to Gaia's Cradle, so we can't produce a large arbitrary amount of green mana as much as we would prefer to. Although there's easier ways to work around this and still win with Finale than there are ways to work around Gaia's Cradle being in play in the absence of Finale. But let's say for whatever reason, Finale got Force of Negated, so it's in exile. An opponent Praetor's grasped you and pulled it out of your deck. An opponent hit you with Ragavan and ripped it off the top and left it in exile, or maybe someone windfalled you and then Bazooka bogged your graveyard, right? There are many reasons why you may, as a Nadu player, even being able to get to this board state, may no longer have access to Finale of Devastation. So the question becomes, how do we win if Finale is out of the equation? Well, this brings us to endurance looping. And endurance looping is kind of convoluted. I would argue it's a bit more of an art than a science. There's no one right way to do it. This is the way I prefer to do endurance loops. So here's a very generic setup. Let's assume that you've Oracletron your entire deck. So these are all the non-land cards in your deck that are now in your hand. Realistically, only 2 of them matter for the sake of this loop, Jeweled Lotus and Lotus Petal. And the reason they matter is because they are non-creature spells, which means when we cast them, we can put a Displacer trigger, kitten trigger on the stack, and we can sacrifice them, which means they get put into our graveyard and then shuffled back in once we flicker Endurance. So these are very important. These are, for all intents and purposes, in your hand. So here's the setup. We have basically thousands of Scute Swarm copies at this point if we've Oracle drawn our entire deck, and a lot of insect tokens. So these are not representing one insect token or one copy. They're representing a myriad of insect tokens and insect copies. So what we're going to do is we're going to start making mana. How are we going to make mana? Because we have Yavimaya Cradle of Growth in our deck, we're going to tap all the lands we have that we can. Dryad Arbor, we probably won't be able to because it doesn't have haste. So let's just set that aside for now, right? But we can tap all our lands for a lot of green mana and some blue, right? Minamo, School at Water's Edge can add for blue. Hedge Maze can add for blue. Unfortunately, that's going to enter tapped after we do our endurance loop, so I'm going to set that aside as well. We can tap Otawara for blue because it will enter untapped. We can tap Mystic Sanctuary for blue. This will more times than not after an endurance loop also enter tapped, so I'm going to set it aside. We can tap this basic island for blue. We can tap this breeding pool for blue. Again, we have to pay 2 light for this to enter untapped, so I'm going to set it aside because our goal isn't to use finite resources, right? So conceivably, we have 3 or 4 cards, again, 2 islands, a Minamo, and an Otawara that we can tap for blue. Then we can tap everything else for green because of Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. And the beautiful thing about Yavimaya is cards that would ordinarily deal us damage when we tap them for mana no longer do so if we choose to tap them for green, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add some blue mana and a lot of green mana to our mana pool by tapping out all our lands in play. Okay? So we've tapped out our lands. We have a lot of green and a lot of blue. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use Sylvan Safekeeper's ability. Sylvan Safekeeper says we can sacrifice a land to give target creature we control Shroud until end of turn. Target one of the Scute Swarm copies or the insect tokens. Again, you should have a ton of these. Sacrifice a land. Then tell your opponents, sacrificing is a cost to Sylvan Safekeeper, targeting one of my thousands of Scute Swarm copy tokens. Hold priority. Sacrifice another land. Sylvan Safekeeper, target the same copy. And repeat this. Again, announcing that you're holding priority. The reason that we do this is Sylvan Safekeeper gives a creature Shroud. So if we don't hold priority, we'd have to target a separate copy every single time we go through this loop. We only want to target 1 copy each time we go through this loop because we're going to generate a ton more of them when we flicker Endurance and then reset this entire loop. Right? Okay. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to hold priority for Sylvan Safekeeper and put all of our lands minus the ones that we won't be able to conveniently loop as well. So I'm just going to move these off the table. Again, these will all come in untapped and they will all add for mana that is blue or green without hurting us, right? These are a little bit more conditional because we can't tap this when it comes into play since it's a creature, so it won't have haste. This will have a Surveil and it enters tap, so we can't really utilize that as well. This will more times than not, because of how Endurance randomizes the order of the cards that are put into our graveyard, will enter tapped. And again, we'd have to pay 2 life every time to get this into play untapped. So it's less useful. So you don't have to sacrifice these lands. I would just leave them aside. Sacrifice all these lands, though. So we floated a lot of mana. We use Sylvan Safekeeper to basically put all of our lands into our graveyard. And do note, every time we use Sylvan Safekeeper to target a copy of Scute Swarm, we are putting a Nadu trigger on the stack. It doesn't matter because we have an empty library. So if you try to Oracle draw with an empty library, you won't lose the game, right? Because the way that ability is worded is you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, it goes into play. If it's a non-land, you put it, not draw it, you put it into your hand. So if you're ever worried about running this combo with an empty library, don't be. Your Nadu triggers, your Oracle draws will not cause you to lose the game from an empty library. So this is in your graveyard. Now, we have a ton of mana floating. We have 1 Scute Swarm copy that's been targeted a ton of times from Sylvan Safekeeper's effect. You don't need to keep track of this. It won't matter because you're always going to be able to generate more Scute Swarms than you can target to continue through the loop. Than you need to target to actually continue through the loop. Okay, now what we're going to do. Remember, we have these 2 cards in our hand. Let's cast Lotus Petal. What this is going to do is it's going to trigger Displacer Kitten. And we're going to blink a creature we control. Or actually, more specifically, a non-land permanent we control. Blink Endurance. And Endurance says, when it enters the battlefield, so cast Lotus Petal, trigger Displacer Kitten, exile, and put back into play Endurance. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent, or target player, puts all cards in their graveyard at the bottom of the library in a random order. We're going to target ourselves. Our graveyard, which is all lands, is going to be shuffled into what will now become our library. Okay? And then this is going to resolve. Again, we still have this Jeweled Lotus in our hand. So we're back to this setup. Immediately sacrifice Jeweled Lotus. Add a blue mana, for instance. Now that Jeweled Lotus is sacrificed, and now that we've have still again, presumably thousands of Scute Swarm copies, start using Shuko to target one of your Scute Swarm copies that has not been targeted with Nadu. Again, you should have thousands of these conceivably. And now with Shuko, we're going to put all the lands we sacrificed back into play, which will trigger Scute Swarm and again make 2 to the factor of n, where n is the number of lands we hit, Scute Swarm copies. Like it's going to be thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of Scute Swarms, right? So we're going to put all of our lands back into play by using Shuko to target one of our thousands of Scute Swarm copies to put lands from the top of our deck into play from our Oracle draw triggers. And eventually what will happen, again, Field of the Dead actually isn't going to be able to add for mana, although it might be able to make some 2/2 zombies. And what we're going to do is we're going to put all these lands back into play. We're going to Oracle draw our entire library, putting all these lands back into play. And again, every time we do this, we make thousands of Scute Swarm copies and dozens of insect tokens, right? So now we're back to kind of the setup, except now we have a Lotus Petal that's in our graveyard, and we still have this Jeweled Lotus in our hand. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to tap all of this for green and blue mana, and then we're going to sacrifice all of this to Sylvan Safekeeper like we did last time. Again, target like an insect token or a copy that's just been created from all these landfall triggers, hold priority. And now our entire land base or mana base is back in our graveyard, along with a Lotus Petal. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cast Jeweled Lotus. That will trigger Displacer Kitten. We blink Endurance. And now, again, our entire library, including that all our lands and that Lotus Petal are now back in our library because we've Enduranced ourselves again. And now, again, what we're going to do is we're going to Shuko another copy. And again, we're going to put all of our lands back into play and that one Lotus Petal back in our hand. Between sacking and alternating Lotus Petal or Jeweled Lotus in our graveyard to trigger Displacer Kitten and Endurance ourselves, we are going to be able to infinitely tap our lands for mana of blue or green, infinitely sacrifice them to target a fresh Scute Swarm copy, since we're going to be generating more than what's required, because we only need to target one of those copies once with Sylvan Safekeeper if we hold priority. We're always going to have more things that we can target with Shuko that will be generated off of landfall triggers than we will have to worry about, right? So we're always going to be able to go through this loop and generate more and more tokens so that we can deterministically put all of these back into play, generate more tokens, etc. So with this loop, we can produce infinite green and infinite blue mana, okay? Now what we're going to do, we have infinite green and we have infinite blue mana. Let's assume that the loop ends and we can establish that, we have to pick a number. So let's just say we have 2 trillion of each of these mana, right? We have 2 trillion green mana, 2 trillion blue mana. So let's just say that we've Enduranced ourselves and it's the Lotus Petal that's back in our library. We have a Jeweled Lotus in hand, right? Now what we're going to do is we're going to use Shuko on one of our copies or insect tokens, put all of these things back into play. Oh, sorry, yeah, we should have a Jeweled Lotus in play. My apologies. And then this Lotus Petal in my hand. So yeah, my bad. So Jeweled Lotus is in play. Lotus Petal's been in our graveyard. We use Jeweled Lotus to reset Endurance, and now we're Oracle drawing all of this again. We have Lotus Petal back in our hand and all these lands back into play. Now what we're going to do, again, now that we've Shukoed ourselves and created a ton more copy tokens, now what we're going to do is, instead of trying to generate infinite mana, what we're going to do is we're going to use some of that blue mana that we've generated and use that blue mana to sacrifice Cephalid Coliseum to our graveyard. We'll sack the Jeweled Lotus too and just put it in our graveyard. And we're going to have an opponent draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards. Okay? Now we're going to do the same thing. Tap this for a ton of mana. Put this in graveyard. Play Lotus Petal. Trigger Displacer Kitten. Flicker Endurance. Okay? Going back through the loop just like we normally would. There's just now an extra step. Now sacrifice the Jeweled Lotus. Use Shuko. Target a bunch of copies that you are continually making from all these landfalls. Put all of these lands back into play. And then put that Jeweled Lotus back in your hand that we shuffled in. There it is. So again, these are all our lands. They're now all back into play. Use some of that infinite blue mana, sack Cephalid Coliseum, put it into your graveyard, have target opponent draw 3 cards and mill 3 cards, tap out, sack these to Sylvan Safekeeper, target one of your copy tokens, rinse and repeat. Then play Jeweled Lotus, flicker Endurance with Displacer Kitten, go through that loop again. What this is doing is I'm now demonstrating a loop where I can force my opponents to draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards until they lose the game, until they mill themselves out and lose by drawing from an empty library. The one caveat to this, right? This is an alternate win con in the absence of Endurance, or in the absence of Finale of Devastation. Your opponents can respond to the Cephalid Coliseum triggers. They can respond at any point during this, but you're giving them new cards whenever they draw 3 and discard 3. So conceivably, they could interact with your combo. However, remember, you've drawn your entire deck already at this point. So this is just your hand. So you're sitting on Swan Song, here's Guardianship, you're sitting on Mindbreak Traps, you're sitting on Flusterstorms, you're sitting on Sight Rifts, you're sitting on an Offer You Can't Refuse, you're sitting on Pact of Negation, you're sitting on all of this, right? So if your opponent tries to react Force of Will, if your opponent's trying to react at instant speed to you, attempting to mill them out, you have all the answers, right? And what the best part is, like, if you use, like, say, Mindbreak Trap, because more than 3 spells have been cast this turn, to exile whatever your opponent is doing to attempt to interact with you, comboing off, right? Or infinitely milling them with Cephalid Coliseum. This will go to your graveyard and be shuffled back in when you reset the loop and be put back into your hand. So you will always be able to reset your endurance loops if you really need to, with your 0 mana counter spells coming back to your hand as well. So yes, in theory, you could also play Dosin so that your opponents can interact with you while you attempt to go through this loop. I don't personally run Dosin, but you also have every interaction piece in the book in your hand already. Because again, a key assumption is that you're able to Oracle draw your entire deck. Alternatively, what you can do, if you really would like to, is you can also use like Noxious Revival and Eternal Witness, and blink like Eternal Witness with Displacer Kitten after you've generated infinite mana. So after you've generated infinite mana this way, you can use Eternal Witness to put, say, Boseiju back in your hand, and then use some of that infinite mana to Boseiju your opponent's artifacts, your opponent's enchantments, your opponent's non-basic lands, and that will force them to search the library for a card that shares a basic land type or a land that shares a basic land type. In cEDH, not many basic lands are played. So at some point, you're just going to be able to wipe all their lands off the field and put all their lands in the graveyard. So if you wanted to, before you started Cephalid Coliseuming your opponents, you could conceivably use Eternal Witness and Boseiju Who Endures to infinitely destroy your opponent's non-basic lands, and then oops, I know the Boseiju's right there. There we go. You could infinitely use Endurance with some of this mana, channel it, blow up your opponent's lands, and then after you've completely wiped your opponents of resources, then you can start the Cephalid Coliseum loop. Again, there's no one right way to do this. Like Eternal Witness and Noxious Revival are other ways that you could kind of do this loop. Endurance is just really streamlined. Most decks run Endurance because it gives you access to these lines of play, and in cEDH, you can Endurance someone's graveyard in response to an Underworld Breach cast or a Thassa's Oracle trigger on the stack, which can effectively stop your opponents from winning at instant speed. But that's the basics of Endurance Loop. You use Displacer Kitten and Endurance and a lot of tokens that you're generating to generate infinite mana and then loop those lands back into your deck with Endurance. And then once you've generated a sufficient amount of blue and green mana, you could start using Cephalid Coliseum to mill your opponents out and win the game that way. I hope this helps. Endurance looping, again, it's more of an art than a science. It does require practice. The best thing I would say is physically take out your deck, do what I just did, set up the loop, set up the necessary pieces for the loop so that when you're in a game, you know exactly what you need in play, and you know exactly from muscle memory how you need to sequence your actions to demonstrate, hey, I can get infinite mana, and hey, this is how I'm going to win with Cephalid Coliseum. Even if your opponents could react to Cephalid Coliseum at instant speed, a lot of them will just concede at that point. Like, yeah, you got us. That's fine. But yeah, thank you for watching. I hope this helps. This is not an easy skill to learn, especially when you are used to running the deck in such a way where finale is just how you're winning 99% of the time. Training your brain to also understand this line and this path to victory is a different acquired skill. So, with that said, thank you for watching.